Hi everyone and welcome back to another video. As we move into the new year at the time of recording, I thought it would be a good idea to stop and reflect on the Phantasy Star franchise. 2025 is a really important year for Phantasy Star, as the franchise will actually be celebrating a few big anniversaries this year. So I thought it would be interesting to break down each of these anniversaries and discuss whether I think we'll see anything as a result. So, from the research that I've done, it seems like there are three main anniversaries that we're celebrating in 2025. The first one is the 35th anniversary of Phantasy Star 3 Generations of Doom. This released on April the 21st, 1990 in Japan. It was 1991 in the West. The second anniversary is the 25th anniversary of Phantasy Star Online, the original Dreamcast version, which launched on December the 21st, 2000 in Japan, and was 2001 in the West. The third anniversary is the 20th anniversary of Phantasy Star Online Blue Burst Episode 4. This is for the Western release though, the Japanese release was actually in 2004, the Western release being in 2005. Now of these, I think we can probably disregard the PSO-BB 20th anniversary, as I've said, that only applies to the Western version. We've already had the 20th anniversary of the Japanese release, and being realistic, I think any acknowledgement of the anniversaries is typically only going to focus on the initial Japanese release, so although we might get a social media post or something, I wouldn't really expect anything else as a result of that, so I'll focus more on the first two. So next, we can move on to the 35th anniversary of Phantasy Star 3 Generations of Doom. So this is a really interesting one, because SEGA have acknowledged the classic Phantasy Star series in the past. For anyone who played PSO2, you'll know that Episode 5 was basically full of references, and it was essentially like a love letter to the original Phantasy Star series. There's no doubt that the classic Phantasy Star series were hugely influential at the time, but over the years, I kind of feel that when most people talk about Phantasy Star, they're actually referring to the online games instead. It's a sad fact, but I do feel that generally if someone is talking about Phantasy Star, they do tend to just mean PSO or PSO2 by default. Now, I think that's likely because it's been so long since we've actually had a classic Phantasy Star JRPG release. The last one outside of any remakes or collections that I'm aware of was 1993's Phantasy Star 4: The End of the Millennium. So the series has been out of the public eye for so long that I would imagine that a lot of current PSO2 NGS players probably aren't even aware of its existence, or certainly have never played it. Even me, who started with PSO, I've only played the first Phantasy Star so far. So, could 2025 be the right time for a classic Phantasy Star JRPG revival? As much as I'd love to see it, unfortunately I do find it quite unlikely. I think Phantasy Star's identity now seems to have made pretty much the seismic shift over to the online games, and I genuinely don't know how popular a new JRPG entry would be. I mean, never say never, and I would love to see it happen, but even for the 35th anniversary of Phantasy Star 3, I would be very surprised if we got a new JRPG entry. There is also the fact that I feel that JRPGs now tend to combine other genres with them. Even Final Fantasy has now moved over to a kind of like action JRPG, so I don't know how popular a JRPG would be now. So with that, I think we should probably just move on to PSO. So there is no doubt that the 25th anniversary of a game as groundbreaking as PSO is a huge deal for fans of the franchise. SEGA have often done something to mark the important anniversaries for the game too. So Phantasy Star Portable 2 Infinity was actually part of the PSO 10th anniversary celebrations, and if you've played Infinity, you'll know that the game is absolutely crammed with references to PSO. There are literally fights against Olga in the game. You can talk to Ridge and Rico and Flowen. It is full of PSO references. It was essentially a massive love letter to PSO. For the 15th anniversary, as far as I'm aware, we didn't get a game for it, but we did get the Phantasy Star Sympathy concert. If you don't know what Sympathy is, it's basically an orchestral concert that is in Japan, where they play Phantasy Star music from the different Phantasy Star games. SEGA, by the way, if you're watching, please bring Sympathy over at the West. We need it over here. The 20th anniversary passed by without much to celebrate that I'm aware of. There may have been a Sympathy concert, possibly, maybe a taped one. As you're probably aware, 2020 was not exactly the year for celebrating things for obvious reasons. So with that being said, that means that 2025, which is PSO's 25th anniversary, is the first time in a long time where I do feel like SEGA has a chance to really celebrate the game. So with that being said, what do I think our options are? So let's start with the worst case scenario. Well, actually the worst case scenario will be we get nothing. Let's move on to the slightly better than worst case scenario. So I think pretty much the worst case scenario would be, aside from getting nothing, would be that we get some kind of PSO tie-in for PSO2 NGS. I think if this was the case, I would imagine that we get things like NGS spec versions of the PSO class outfits, maybe PSO music in the lobbies, and potentially they could add some more of the rune enemies from PSO. I don't mean runes as in the area from PSO, I mean rune as in the enemy types from NGS. We have already had things like Gal Griffin, so Gal Griffin came back as Ruin Griffin. So there is some precedent for this, so we could potentially see maybe some more PSO enemies getting ported over. However, PSO, as far as I'm aware, Gal Griffin was also in PSO2 base, so that could also be why they chose that. Now, while this would be cool for NGS players, I do kind of feel that if this is all that SEGA did, it would be a bit of a disappointment for players like me who grew up playing PSO. Admittedly, I think a lot of the players who played PSO back in the day, a lot of them have moved on to other things now. So SEGA will probably cater more towards the NGS fanbase, understandably. But I feel that although NGS players might enjoy it, I don't think it would really be enough to hype up PSO's 25th anniversary personally. So next option, we could, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we could potentially get another Sympathy concert. They do seem to do them every so often. I can't remember when the last one was. I want to say it was maybe around 2023, but I could be wrong. Now, while these concerts are incredibly cool, I would thoroughly recommend anyone to go to a video game concert if you haven't before. They are incredible. The issue with Sympathy is that so far Sympathy has only ever been in Japan. And I feel that for a 25th anniversary, it would be really, really disappointing if only the Japanese fanbase got to experience it. I would love them to do a tour for Sympathy. Now, SEGA have dabbled with this a little bit in the past. You know, there has recently been a Sonic tour, which I don't know if that's still ongoing or not, but they have done a Sonic music tour, which did come to the US as well. Phantasy Star obviously is a lot more niche than Sonic, so I don't know if there'll be the demand for it, but I'll go. If you bring it over here, I'll go. Now, I am aware that SEGA did manage to release DVDs of the performance, but again, I think even those were predominantly only sold in Japan. You may be able to get them other ways, but typically they were aimed at the Japanese audience. And also, a DVD, not the same as experiencing the concert for yourself. So as much as I love video game concerts, I would prefer if any anniversary celebration for PSO was something that the whole fan base could take part in rather than just Japan. I do also understand, however, that Japan is the primary fan base for PSO. So next up, the two more interesting ones. So we could potentially get a re-release or a remaster of PSO. Now personally, I feel like there is a small chance of this. With things like the Nintendo Switch 2 on the horizon, it would potentially be a perfect console for an option to take PSO on the go. I feel like PSO as a game translates really well to a portable. I think that it's the kind of game where you can just jump in, do a run, try and find some rares and go off. You don't have to spend hours and hours and hours if you don't want to. You can play it quite casually. Admittedly, if you want to hunt some of the rarer stuff, you can be there for a long time. But I feel the way that PSO plays would translate to a handheld quite well. So yeah, I think even if it was just a re-release of PSO BB, I think it would translate to something like the Switch really well. And the same for a remaster as well. A remaster could also potentially reinvigorate some interest in the older games and could be great fun on any platform, but especially on a portable one. Now, how likely is this? I personally, again, I don't have any inside sources or anything, unfortunately, but for me, I think the chance of a re-release of PSO is something that it has potential to happen. I'm not going to say it's likely, but I think there is a potential for it. SEGA, as you might know, have been going back and looking at a lot of their old franchises lately, and are doing a lot of new games with some of their old IPs. There's a potential that maybe they could look into Phantasy Star again. However, I am somewhat skeptical about whether SEGA would remaster the game, the reasons I'll go into shortly. So the next option is potentially a full remake of one of the Phantasy Star games. Now this is where I do start to feel very conflicted. For me, as much as a full remake of something like PSO would be really, really interesting, I would be really, really worried that it wouldn't capture the magic of the original games. The same is also true for a remaster, but to a lesser extent. Because of that, I think if a Phantasy Star was getting a full remake, I would actually prefer it to be done to one of the classic JRPGs. As fun as the classic JRPGs are from what I've played, again, bearing in mind I've only really played the first one, they could probably benefit from some modern quality of life improvements. Now, we have kind of had that with the SEGA Ages version of Phantasy Star 1, and I am a big fan of that. I do like some of the changes they made with that. However, there is a distinct lack of this for any of the other Phantasy Star games, so 2, 3 and 4 are still very, very old school. So it would be cool to see maybe them get some quality of life improvements. However, I do also realise that the same risk is present where if you do remake or remaster something, there is a risk that the heart and the soul of the game could get ripped out if the remake isn't done carefully. Now, on the subject of remakes and remasters, I'm generally of the mindset that if a game is extremely old and dated, a good remaster or a remake can potentially help to bring it back up to standard and help a whole new generation enjoy it again. And I think Final Fantasy VII is a really, really good example of that, where the remake, although it's very, very different to the original game, it's still a fantastic experience. It explores Final Fantasy VII to people who probably didn't play the original, probably people who weren't even born when the original released. But it's also being very faithful so that people who played the original don't feel too alienated, even though they have made some changes. On the other hand, however, a bad remaster can drive people away, and I think an example of that is, to keep with Final Fantasy, the Final Fantasy VIII Remaster. The Final Fantasy VIII Remaster is a disaster. You have scenes in that game where you have remastered assets in the same scene as original assets that just clash really badly, and it looks terrible. The game itself plays fine, but yeah, there are some areas in that game where you can tell how much they've cheaped out on the remaster. Now, I think that PSO is such a revered game by its fan base for how revolutionary it was, and how many memories we've all made with the game, that a lot of us are very understandably nervous about any potential remaster or remake. Especially, given track record with some of the games, it's a risky proposition to say the least. The other issue with remasters and remakes, for PSO in particular, is the existence of private servers. Now, there are a few elements to this. So first of all, why would you want to play a remaster if you can play a version of the game that's got loads of quality of life improvements already on a private server? It's a very hard sell. Secondly is, if Sega did remaster or remake PSO, would they still ignore the private servers as they seem to at the moment? How would fans react if their private server characters disappeared and the servers were shut down? And especially if the remaster didn't hold up? I, for one, would be pretty miffed. And this would potentially drive players away, which is obviously not what we want, and it's not what Sega want either. Now, finally, there is one other very, very big problem with a potential PSO remaster or remake, and it goes by the name of Phantasy Star Online-2 New Genesis. If PSO was remastered with online play, surely some NGS players would pull away from NGS to go and check PSO out, which is obviously then going to have an effect on NGS's population. On the flip side, would a player who's just started the franchise recently with PSO2 or NGS, would they really be interested in what they might see as a janky old game like PSO? Probably not. I am aware there are some people who started with PSO2 and then gone back and checked out the older games, but the reality is that a lot of people are going to find PSO very difficult to get into, especially if it was just a re-release or a remaster. It's a very, very clunky, very janky game, which, if you're not from that generation of people who played the game, you might really not see what the fuss is about. Honestly, it's kind of hard for me to see how Sega would make any kind of reasonable profit from a PSO remaster, as much as it pains me to admit it. With all that being said though, I honestly feel like the most likely outcome, unfortunately, is probably an NGS and PSO tie-in. Maybe a social media post if we're lucky. I, like many others, would love to see SEGA do something special for PSO's 25th anniversary, but I'm not sure. There are a lot of issues in the way of it, in my opinion. Now for me, PSO was an absolutely groundbreaking game, even though I started with the GameCube version in 2003. It brought people together, it forged friendships, it established a legacy that it still persists today. When private servers still routinely attract hundreds of players 20 years later, it's clear that PSO has a very, very special place in some people's hearts. And here's hoping that SEGA feel the same way. Now, I also, just to wrap this up, I also want to know what you guys think as well. Do you think that SEGA will acknowledge any of the anniversaries in 2025? Do you want to see a Phantasy Star game get remastered or remade? What's your general opinion of remakes and remasters? Are you for them, against them? Let me know what you think in the comments below. So this is basically just been me rambling about what I'm hoping for this year. Even if we get nothing, I will keep playing PSO, as I have done for the last 20 odd years, and I imagine a lot of other people will do the same as well. So that being said, I'll end this video there. If you have enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, join as a member on YouTube. You can also follow or sub over on Twitch if you want to. I have a Twitter, which is Section Skyline, and we do have a Discord you can join as well, where you can discuss all things Phantasy Star and other games as well. So hopefully see you over there. Yeah, thanks for watching, and let's see what the new year brings.